Ethan Walker had always dreamed of escaping the chaos of city life. After years of grinding away in a corporate engineering job, he finally inherited his grandfather's farm, a sprawling, peaceful stretch of land just outside town. It was everything he had ever wanted: wide open fields, a quiet atmosphere, and absolute control over his property. Unlike the tightly packed suburban developments creeping closer each year, his farm was self-sustaining, equipped with solar panels, modern irrigation, and a state-of-the-art greenhouse. But paradise never lasts. The first sign of trouble came on a bright afternoon when a well-dressed woman arrived at his front gate, flanked by two clipboard-wielding assistants. Regina Holloway, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She was the kind of person who smiled while tightening the noose. Her tone was syrupy and sweet, but Ethan recognized the type immediately. She wasted no time explaining why she was there. According to her, the expansion of Oak Ridge Estates meant certain adjustments needed to be made to ensure all properties aligned with community standards. Ethan leaned against his gate, arms crossed. "So, in plain English, you're saying you want me to sign up for HOA rules?" Regina let out a well-rehearsed chuckle. "Not want, Mr. Walker. We require compliance from all properties that fall within our extended community. It's for the good of everyone." That was all Ethan needed to hear. "Well, I appreciate the visit," he said, tipping his hat. "But I'm not part of your HOA. My farm isn't on your development's land, and I have no interest in beautification projects that don't involve actual farming." Regina's smile faltered slightly. "I understand your perspective," she said, voice tightening. "But surely you see the value of aligning with the greater community. We wouldn't want any conflicts to arise later." There it was, the thinly veiled threat. Ethan wasn't about to let some self-important HOA president dictate what he did on land that had been in his family for generations. "I'll take my chances," he said, closing the gate in her face. Regina's assistants exchanged nervous glances. Her manicured nails gripped the clipboard a little too tightly. She wasn't used to being told no. And this was only the beginning. The letters started arriving within a week. At first, they were just annoyances, official-looking envelopes stamped with the Oak Ridge Estates logo, filled with polite yet insistent wording about necessary compliance and alignment with community standards. Ethan ignored them. His property wasn't part of the HOA, and as far as he was concerned, their rules didn't apply to him. But the letters didn't stop. In fact, they became more aggressive. The notices claimed his fencing was out of alignment with the aesthetic of the greater community, that his unauthorized land use required review. One even included a vague reference to potential fines for noncompliance. Ethan had a good laugh the first time he read one, shaking his head at the absurdity of an HOA trying to regulate a farm. But the amusement wore off quickly as the letters kept coming. Then came the unexpected visits. One morning, Ethan caught movement near his back fence and went out to investigate. Two men in polo shirts, each wearing HOA badges, were wandering along his property line, jotting notes onto clipboards. He watched from a distance, curious to see what they were up to. When one of them pulled out a tape measure and started marking something down, Ethan decided he'd had enough. He approached, hands in his pockets, voice calm but firm. "Something I can help you with?" The two men startled slightly before regaining their composure. One, a wiry guy with glasses, cleared his throat. "We're conducting a routine inspection on behalf of Oak Ridge Estates, just making sure all properties in the area are up to standard." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's so? Because this isn't Oak Ridge Estates. It's my farm, which you're currently trespassing on." The other man, who had been quiet until now, gave a nervous chuckle. "We were told this land was under HOA jurisdiction." Ethan leaned in slightly. "Who told you that?" Neither of them answered right away. Instead, the first one flipped through his notes before muttering, "It's part of our extended review. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure we can." "There's no misunderstanding," Ethan interrupted. "I don't answer to your HOA. So unless you've got a warrant, you two are going to turn around and leave." The men hesitated before finally backing off, mumbling something about checking with the board. Ethan watched them go, knowing full well who had sent them. Regina wasn't going to take no for an answer. A few days later, Ethan returned from a supply run to find a brand new sign posted near the edge of his property. It bore the HOA's logo and read, "Future Community Enhancement Zone, pending development review." Ethan's jaw clenched. He yanked the sign out of the ground and tossed it into the back of his truck. There was no pending development on his land, at least, not when he had approved. The next morning, he woke up to find a different kind of surprise, a formal letter, hand-delivered, notifying him that an official compliance officer would be visiting the property for an assessment of outstanding violations. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. He could already tell where this was going. Sure enough, Regina showed up later that afternoon, flanked by a man in a suit, likely one of the HOA's legal representatives. Ethan didn't bother inviting them past the gate. He simply stood there, arms crossed, while Regina's smile stretched just a little too tight. "Mr. Walker," she began smoothly, I do hope we can resolve this amicably. As I'm sure you're aware, your property is now within Oak Ridge Estate's influence, and we need to ensure all landowners are maintaining the proper standards. Ethan let out a short laugh. You hope we can resolve this amicably? Regina, let me put this plainly. I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority here. The lawyer beside her cleared his throat. That's not entirely accurate. Ethan's expression darkened. Oh, enlighten me. The lawyer adjusted his tie. Due to municipal zoning expansions, certain properties now fall under the community oversight of Oak Ridge Estates. While your farm is technically classified as agricultural, there is a legal gray area regarding compliance with community standards. Ethan could barely believe what he was hearing. You mean to tell me that because your development is creeping closer, you suddenly think you get a say in what happens on my land? Regina's smile didn't falter. We simply want to work together to find a solution that benefits everyone. Ethan took a slow breath, already knowing where this was heading. Not happening. Ethan knew Regina wouldn't back down, but he also knew that bullies thrived on fear, and he wasn't afraid. The next morning, he paid a visit to the county records office. After an hour of sifting through zoning documents, he found exactly what he was looking for. His property was not within Oak Ridge Estate's legal jurisdiction. In fact, the HOA had no claim over any of the farms surrounding the development. The municipal gray area the lawyer had mentioned was nothing more than a technicality. Armed with this knowledge, Ethan did what any reasonable man would do. He put up a sign of his own. At the same spot where the HOA had staked their bogus Future Community Enhancement Zone marker, Ethan drove a new post into the ground. A bold red sign hung from it, reading, Private property, no trespassing. Non-HOA zone, no solicitors. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It didn't take long for Regina to see it. By the afternoon, she was standing at his gate again, this time with 2 HOA board members and a uniformed compliance officer. This is unnecessary, Ethan, she called out, voice dripping with forced patience. We only want to establish an understanding. Ethan leaned against his truck, arms crossed. The only understanding we need is that you have no claim over my land. I checked the zoning laws. You're bluffing. Regina's lips pressed into a thin line. The compliance officer shifted uncomfortably. That may be true, she began. It is true. She ignored the correction. But this isn't just about zoning. This is about community cohesion. Your property is a visual part of Oak Ridge Estates, and your unwillingness to follow the same guidelines as your neighbors is, frankly, disruptive. Ethan smirked. I run a farm. If you don't like the view, plant some trees. The older man beside Regina, one of her more loyal board members, cleared his throat. Mr. Walker, let's be reasonable. No one wants this to escalate. If you voluntarily adhere to some basic HOA guidelines. Ethan held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. No, I don't answer your HOA. I don't care about your guidelines. And if anyone from your board sets foot on my property again, I'll have them charged with trespassing. Regina's face twitched. Ethan smiled. Now, unless you have an actual legal claim, get off my land. The compliance officer glanced at Regina. When she didn't respond, he nodded at Ethan and muttered, have a nice day, before turning back toward the car. Regina didn't follow immediately. Instead, she lingered a moment longer, looking at Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite place. This isn't over, she finally said. Ethan's grin widened. It sure as hell is on my end. Ethan enjoyed a brief period of peace after that. For a couple of weeks, the letters stopped. The unannounced visits ceased. The HOA seemed to back off, licking their wounds. Then, one morning, a county inspector showed up at his door. Ethan greeted the man, tall, stocky, and wearing a city badge, with wary curiosity. Something I can do for you? The inspector flipped open a folder. We received an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. Ethan's stomach tightened. Anonymous, huh? Let me guess, someone from Oak Ridge Estates. The man gave a non-committal shrug. Couldn't say, but we have to follow up. Ethan exhaled slowly, motioning for the inspector to follow him. He walked him through the farm, pointing out the barn, greenhouse, and fencing, all of which had proper permits that he kept neatly filed in his office. After a thorough review, the inspector shut his folder. Everything checks out. Sorry for the hassle. Ethan shook his head. Not your fault, but I'd love to know who keeps filing bogus complaints. The inspector gave him a knowing look. These things tend to come from people with too much time on their hands. Ethan grinned. Yeah, I know the type. The inspector left, and Ethan wasted no time. That afternoon, he had his lawyer draft an official cease and desist letter addressed to the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. To whom it may concern. Any further attempts to enforce unauthorized HOA policies on my private property will be considered harassment. Any additional complaints filed against my land under false pretenses will be pursued as fraudulent activity. You do not have jurisdiction over my farm. You do not have legal authority over my land. I strongly advise you to cease all further actions immediately. By the next morning, the letter had been delivered to Regina's office. and the war was officially declared. Regina must have realized she was losing because her next move was desperate. Ethan came home one afternoon to find a construction crew digging near his fence. "What the hell?" he muttered, slamming his truck door and striding toward them. The workers glanced up, but kept digging. Ethan approached the nearest man. "Who authorized this?" The worker wiped the sweat from his brow. "We're extending Oak Ridge Estates drainage system. HOA project." Ethan's pulse pounded. "This is an HOA property. This is my land." The worker frowned. "They told us they had permission." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. "Well, they lied. Stop what you're doing." The foreman, a burly guy in a neon vest, walked over. "Look, we're just doing our job. If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA." Ethan pulled out his phone. "You got 5 minutes to pack up before I call the sheriff." That got their attention. The crew packed up fast, but Ethan wasn't done. He drove straight to the sheriff's office, filed a trespassing complaint, and then followed up with his lawyer. By that evening, a formal cease-work order had been issued against Oak Ridge Estates. Regina didn't see it coming. The next morning, she stormed onto his property, her polished heels sinking into the dirt. "You had no right to interfere," she snapped. Ethan stood on his porch, arms crossed. "Says the woman trying to dig trenches on land she doesn't own." She huffed. "That drainage system was for the benefit of the entire community. Your stubbornness is costing people." Ethan stepped closer. "You want drainage? Dig on your land." She glared at him, fists clenched. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and marched away. As Ethan watched her leave, he knew one thing for sure. Regina wasn't just angry. She was desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. Ethan knew better than to underestimate a desperate opponent. Regina had been backed into a corner, and a cornered predator was at its most dangerous. He braced himself for whatever she planned next. It didn't take long. A week after the drainage debacle, Ethan was awakened at dawn by the flashing red and blue lights of a sheriff's patrol car. He pulled on his boots and walked outside, where 2 officers stood near the barn, hands resting on their belts. "Mr. Walker," the taller one called. Ethan nodded. "What's going on?" The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "We received a report that you have an unregistered septic system that's leaking hazardous waste." Ethan blinked. "Excuse me." The officer handed him a printed complaint. It was filed anonymously, again, but the wording was familiar. "Regina," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Mind if we take a look?" the taller officer asked. Ethan sighed. "Be my guest. But you're not going to find anything. My septic system is fully up to code." The officers did a thorough check and, unsurprisingly, found nothing. By the time they left, Ethan was fuming. Regina had officially crossed the line into false reporting to law enforcement. And that was a criminal offense. Ethan wasted no time. He called his lawyer and filed a formal harassment complaint against Regina in the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Then, he called the local news. Within days, a journalist arrived at his farm, eager to report on the growing battle between the HOA and a private landowner. The article went viral locally, featuring photos of Ethan's violations, his harmless wildflower garden, the freshly painted barn, and the so-called non-compliant fencing. Regina was livid. At the next HOA board meeting, she demanded a public statement discrediting Ethan and accusing him of damaging the reputation of Oak Ridge Estates. But to her shock, the other board members, who had already grown tired of her obsession, refused. Instead, one of them, a middle-aged man named Robert, stood up and said, "Regina, this has gone too far. We're not backing you on this anymore." The room fell silent. Regina turned red. "Excuse me." Robert folded his arms. "Ethan's farm isn't part of the HOA. We have no jurisdiction over it. And now you've brought bad press down on all of us." A few board members nodded in agreement. Regina's grip on the HOA was slipping. Fast. The real turning point came when Ethan received a cease and desist letter from Regina's own HOA attorney. It was an attempt to silence him, citing defamation and public attacks against the HOA. Ethan's lawyer laughed when he read it. "She really doesn't know when to quit, does she?" "No," Ethan agreed. "But I do." The next day, Ethan held a press conference in front of his property. Flanked by his lawyer, local business owners, and neighbors who supported him, he addressed the harassment he had endured. "This isn't about community standards," he told the cameras. "This is about an HOA abusing its power. And I won't be bullied off my own land." The segment aired that night. The very next morning, Regina resigned from her position as HOA president. Her downfall was swift and absolute. With Regina gone, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA backed off completely. The harassment stopped. The board elected a new president, one who immediately issued a public apology to Ethan. And just like that, the war was over. Ethan celebrated the only way he knew how, with a massive neighborhood barbecue. He invited everyone, even the folks who had stayed neutral during the fight. And when the sun set that evening, as music played and laughter filled the air, Ethan sat back and looked over his land. the land he had fought for and won. For the first time in months, he could breathe. A month later, a for sale sign appeared in Regina's yard. She was leaving Oak Ridge Estates for good. Ethan didn't go to watch her leave. He didn't need to. The victory was his, and he had no interest in gloating. Instead, he walked to the edge of his property, looked out at the land his grandfather had passed down to him, and smiled. The farm was safe. His home was his own, and no HOA would ever change that.